actually coined the term entheogen, and Jonathan has experience in field collecting in Mexico, where he lives, and manages a natural products laboratory and a botanical garden on medicinal herbs, and these many other things. And yeah, we're very happy that you're here and you made the journey to join us. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Warm welcome.
Well, this time I'm going to speak in English, which is my mother tongue, my first language. I believe it will be more easily understood by French, English, and even Swiss and German sisters and brothers. I met Albert Hofmann in October of 1977. I had met Richard Evans Schultes. He gave a lecture at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I was able to speak with him at a kind of cocktail party in the home of one of the Boston professors who had invited me. And he invited me to come to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to use the Oaks Ames Library, because I told him I was writing my first book. I did it as a student project, and I had asked him to write an introduction for it, which he did, and it helped him to get it published. So I had hitchhiked 5,000 kilometers across the country in the winter. This was the winter of 1976 to 1977. And that time I asked Dr. Schultes to present me by telephone to Albert Hofmann in Basel here, or in Wichita, where he lived. And Schultes did so. And through Schultes, that's how I met both Wasson and Hofmann. It was like a diplomatic passport to the Empyrean realms of these great researchers and great humanists who otherwise would have had no reason to pay any particular attention to me as a young student. So I invited Albert to a conference, the second conference I'd organized, on visionary mushrooms, which was in Port Townsend, Washington, on the Great Peninsula overlooking the Straits of Juan de Fuca and Vancouver Island on the other side. So he came with Anita, his wife, from Corvallis, Oregon, where he'd been invited by some professor to give a lecture. He came on the Greyhound bus, which we call the diesel dog in the U.S. And it's very big for the city. It's not anyway, it was kind of interesting to meet in that way. So they stepped off, this is in Tumwater, Washington, where the Olympia Brewery is. And so we met there, and drove to the house that I had at the time, which was overlooking this is the state capital, Olympia, Washington, which is probably the most beautiful state capital in the U.S. I know all of them. And so getting out of the car, walking into the house, I addressed a few words in German to Albert. I had studied it 3 years in high school and 1 year at university. Didn't learn much. I'd read a little bit of German, Hermann Hesse, Friedrich Dürrenmatt, but mostly I'd forgotten, so I'd had to think, how can I say something in German? And I basically said, well, I studied German for a few years, and I just wanted to greet him also in not necessarily, it's not exactly his native tongue, because that would be Swiss German. And even before we went into the house, Albert was immediately very happy. And he said, oh, you must translate my book, which I hadn't even heard of, no one had. He was still writing it. And and what could I say, but it would be my honor to do so. But at the same time, I was like shocked and amazed, and I thought, well, I'm not capable of doing this. I almost failed German, the second year of German at Swarthmore College. I got a D in the second semester and just barely passed the 2-year requirement. So I told Albert that, that I'm not very good in German, and he said, no, I would much rather have someone that loves LSD and that knows about this subject than some expert in translation. And he said, moreover, I will come, you work it out, I will come to your house, and we'll go over it together, page by page. And that happened. That was on Vashon Island, also another beautiful rural area, a small island by ferry from near Seattle. So he came, and we worked out the translation. He was very pleased with it. I'm much less so, because I thought it was too rigid and too literal. I felt like I was like a novice in some kind of a monastery translating the sacred scriptures, and I didn't dare go beyond a very literal interpretation of his words. So I knew it was too rigid and it wasn't literal at all. Now, I recently rewrote it in English, and it was published by Oxford University Press, along with the translation of Einsicht und Ausblicke, which had already been translated into English, but Albert wasn't particularly pleased with that translation, and he asked me to do that. So that was kind of the basis, the start of our friendship. Then we met in New York to shop the book around and to publishers. By then I could barely afford a plane ticket. I didn't have to hitchhike to New York that time. That was like 1979, the year it came out in German, and it came out the next year in English. And he had already made kind of a deal with McGraw-Hill, because Wasson had chosen McGraw-Hill to publish The Wondrous Mushroom. He financed his books himself. They were all the best possible production, but he wanted to have the imprint of some major publisher. He had worked with Houghton Mifflin, but this time it was McGraw-Hill. And they also were publishing Plants of the Gods, along with The Wondrous Mushroom. So it seemed natural that LSD, My Problem Child, came with these other books. But Albert didn't know this, but McGraw-Hill is not like a trade book publisher. They are a textbook and scientific magazine type publisher. And it was just one particular division. It was a very big company, a big building on 6th Avenue in New York. And it was they did briefly promote the 3 books together. They did a horrible production job on LSD, My Problem Child, with a kind of Halloween-looking cover, very ugly, cheap, or badly produced. And Albert and I both thought that it would be a big seller in the U.S., but as it turned out, it was the place where it sold the least a number of copies. It sold more in Japan, where LSD was never a very big thing. And so it turned out that the man, the division, well, anyway, we talked to an agent, and he said, no, you don't want McGraw-Hill to publish this because it's not their business, and so forth. He had wined and dined us at the Russian Tea Room and so forth, trying to get the commission on shopping the book. So anyway, but Albert decided it was better to go with Plants of the Gods, with Schultes and Wasson's book. So anyway, they came out together. They advertised it briefly in Science News, which is a weekly kind of popular science magazine, now I think only online, and within about 3 or 4 months, couldn't have been much more, the McGraw-Hill fired the entire division that had published these 3 books when the higher-ups found that they had published 3 books about dangerous illegal narcotics and hippie drugs and so on and so forth. That whole division was eliminated from the company. The books were taken off the market. So I bought the remainders. Albert and I bought the remaining copies for $1 a piece, because otherwise they would end up in some wholesale catalog, or else simply recycled. Anyway, that's not what I wish to talk about. But another event, which was about 10 years later. By 1986, I had moved to Mexico. Reagan had been reelected in 1984. I thought, even though people saw in the debates that he was senile, he had flashcards with the answers, and the questions were all predetermined. And he mixed up the cards and was answering the wrong questions, and everybody noticed it except him. And he still won the election by a landslide. And I thought, no, I'm not safe in a country with such dumb people, and I had a rural laboratory, a drug lab, but it was a legal business. But also I was known for speaking and organizing conferences and publishing about dangerous illegal narcotics and so on and so forth. And my biggest fear has always been prison, to end up in prison in the U.S. And so I just didn't feel safe when Reagan got reelected, and circumstances conspired. I fell in love with a Mexican woman. My first marriage was on the rocks because my first wife became a Jesus freak, anyway, that's not to the point. So now I was living in Mexico, and I built my first house and I built my second house, both designed by me and built largely with my own hands. The only way I could get a house was because I never had a job or anything. Was nobody would lend me money or a mortgage or anything. Was to learn how to build and make money along the way to buy materials. So I had this house. I had my lab in the house. My Mexican wife had her dance studio because she's a professional dancer, with a beautiful big dance studio in the house. Fantastic place. So I decided, well, we'll invite Albert and Anita to inaugurate the new house, which was called Rancho Ololiuqui. Ololiuqui means a little round thing in Nahuatl, and it's the name for the seeds of Turbina corymbosa, the morning glory seeds, from which Albert isolated lysergic acid alkaloids, which he called a magic circle. He found as natural products the same compounds that he was working with as artificial creations of the laboratory in the 1940s. And so we invited them. That's the only time I ever lied to Albert. I told him a rich friend had paid for the plane tickets, and so forth, but that wasn't true. I didn't want him to feel uncomfortable that I was paying for it. So anyway, they came, and we lived with my second wife's family. They had a ranch. They were then growing avocado, but changing to macadamia nut. Beautiful place, and we had built the house on their land, and a very close family, and I was very happy with them. In fact, when we split up, she went to Mexico City, and I lived with my ex-in-laws for 6 years after that. All my friends thought that was really weird. They couldn't understand it. But I had become friends with them before, when Jael, my second wife, was a little girl, only 11 years old. Anyway, So we invited Albert and Anita to come, and the house wasn't quite ready. We were racing to get the basics, the water connected, and so forth. For this, and so it was a little bit rough still. So, but Albert was very, very open, adaptable, and he loved strange and new things, just as I do. And so it was, and got along really well with my in-laws, who were very cultured people, and so. Even this place is not far from the state capitol, only about 6 kilometers as the crow flies, but unfortunately we're not crows, and it was not very easy to get there. Very bad stone road, roundabout way, no telephone service. There still is no telephone service. And so it's very rustic. Now there are a couple of paved roads, but it's still very rustic. I call it bucolic, and that's what I like. So, but nonetheless, anywhere that Albert goes, he attracts attention. And so a woman named Beatriz, who's a social reporter for the very provincial local newspaper called the Diario de Jalapa, wished to interview him for the newspaper. And so she came to the house, and Albert sat for the interview, and they brought a photographer, came out in this really crappy local newspaper. I have the clipping somewhere in my files if it hasn't completely molded away. I live in a cloud forest, which is very comfortable for me, but it isn't for my books. And so Beatriz said, invited us to have lunch at another house, which was 2 kilometers farther out, up the mountain on the side of this volcano, because she said her husband had questions for Albert and wished to speak with him. Now, we found this to be very strange. Her husband was a retired physician, medical doctor, but he was famous, or I should say infamous, in the region for being a hermit that didn't like people. I had never even heard him speak. I'd seen him many times because I would walk to Jalapa. I don't like cars so much, and I like walking, and it was just as fast to walk as to go on this crappy road in a roundabout way to get there. And so I would sometimes we would cross paths on the road, and I later found out that I was the only person that he sort of liked because I did that, because I walked when I had a car. And he was very much not just a hermit, but an ecological fanatic, and in a violent way. He had a 60-hectare piece of property, very beautiful. And he was known for taking pot shots at the locals who were trying to collect firewood on his property, and he just didn't like people at all. And as I said, never even heard him speak. And so we found this to be very strange, but we accepted the invitation. So at the time, I had this 1972 Toyota Land Cruiser, which was not like the modern ones. It was a real truck, or lorry, not a car at all, four-wheel drive. And it was necessary to drive through 2 rivers and to get there, only 2 kilometers farther, but this was beyond the small village, which is called Rancho Viejo, and he was the only person then that lived that far out. And so she had given us directions. I more or less knew where it was, but I didn't know there was a house there, and it must have been very difficult to build that house there. And so, then we had to negotiate along this river called the Rio Chocolulapan, a very bad stone road made with river rocks. And she had said then there's a turn off and a very steep driveway. So once I could see ahead about that must be the turnoff, suddenly out of a ditch beside the road, Arnoldo, whom I call the latter-day St. Anthony, literally popped up out of the ditch. He would do this. He would lie lurking, skulking in some place in case somebody came to try and steal firewood or whatever to protect ecologically his property. So he literally popped up out of the ditch. And he looked like Gustave Doré's illustrations of the Ancient Mariner in Coleridge's great poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. A gray hair, long beard, very, how did Coleridge say that? Glittering eye, the glittering eye. And he had like a foul weather gear, like a mariner. He was literally lying in the ditch. It's very wet there, and it was extremely odd that he popped up. So I said, "Well, jump in. We'll drive you up." And he just shook his head. And so we went up this very steep road. Driveway, which is about 120 meters, and later I'll explain how I know that, to where the house was. And he was like a goat. He got there before we did. He went by some alternate path. Then he would have been around my age, around 70 years old. And he was at the top by the time we got up there. So we get out of the car, and it's gloomy, as it often is. This is cloud forest, 1,600 meters, subtropical. And so he didn't say a word, nothing. We're just standing there outside of the house. So I'm trying to make conversation. I didn't know if he spoke English. I assumed he certainly didn't speak German, and I wasn't even sure he could speak at all because I'd never heard him say anything, and he didn't say anything. So Albert and Anita were, like me, and my wife was there. No, wait, she wasn't there. So that's not the case. We found this extremely odd. Very odd. And so this went on for about 25 minutes, I would say, standing outside. And it wasn't cold or anything. It wasn't yet raining, but not comfortable, uncomfortable situation. And, I'm kind of a joker. I like to mix things up and make people laugh and so forth. So after a while, I started, prodding him, not just trying to make conversation, but like making kind of snide comments and so forth. Well, Arnoldo, you wanted to ask Dr. Hofmann, well, here he is, and so forth. And then it started to rain, just drizzle. This was the summer, but that's when it would rain really hard with hailstones and so forth, and it might have been a precursor to that. So literally I had to invite us into the house. I said, well, why don't we go inside? And so forth. He didn't invite us in or anything. And so he said nothing. So we went into the house. It was just kind of gloomy. It had there was a skylight by the fireplace that was open so that some liana could grow up through it, and the rain came in that part, and there was no electricity at all. It had running water from a spring by a gravity feed. So we get into the house, and we invite ourselves to sit down in the sort of the gloomy living room, and Arnoldo was standing up the whole time, and he didn't really say anything. I kept saying, well, we were trying to get him to say, what did you want to ask Dr. Hofmann? We could tell there was no lunch happening. There was no, you couldn't smell no food being made. And Beatrice, his wife, the reporter, she was much younger than him, and social reporter, she was obviously a social person. Talk about an odd couple, and he was not. And so it was evident that she wasn't coming, and lunch wasn't going to happen, and so forth. But so then I started getting really sarcastic with Arnoldo, and kind of like, like berating him for being so rude to these foreign guests that had been invited by his wife, specifically because he wished to ask questions of Dr. Hofmann. And so, but I couldn't get anything out of him. He would just mumble, and it was really strange, extremely strange. But I find this kind of thing to be very entertaining, and I think Albert and Anita did also. But it was uncomfortable, of course, a very uncomfortable social situation. So that went on for about another half an hour, 45 minutes or so, and couldn't get anything out of the guy. So we were kind of talking among ourselves a little bit, and but trying to interact with him. Very strange, very strange. So then finally he speaks, and he says, I don't think Beatrice is coming. Sometimes she doesn't come. So this is like, okay, that's our cue to leave, because lunch is not happening, and he had nothing to say, and so forth. Maybe he had tried LSD in the past, I don't know. My ex-wife was friends with two of his children, who are also artists like her, and I knew them also. Anyway, so we kind of get up and leave, and that was it with Arnoldo. So over the years, we would remember this, Albert and Anita and I, and kind of laugh about it. It was like a very amusing thing, most unusual. And so nothing. He didn't ask any questions, and then we didn't see Beatrice after that during the whole visit. And then a couple of nights later, the highlight of their visit was we had an official inauguration of the Rancho Oloriuki, and Albert would always bring Sandoz Deliced. When Sandoz in 1965 officially stopped distributing it for research, he took all of the stash to his house of psilocybin and LSD. And he told me that in the whole time at Sandoz, they probably didn't make more than 50 grams of LSD, perhaps 100 grams, was the totality of what was genuine Sandoz LSD, or Deliced was the trade name, and the patents had expired in I think 1963. No, yeah, it was 61 probably. Psilocybin was also patented as Indocybin. And so every time Albert would come visit me, he would have his own visiting cards, postcard size, beautifully engraved with just his name, no address, and his titles of various degrees. And he would put the doses in little foil packets and Scotch tape them onto the back. And there would be one card with, each one had 10 milligrams of psilocybin, and another one, each one had 100 micrograms of LSD. And one time this time when he came to Mexico, he had them in an envelope, and he'd made sure to put my name and address on it in case he lost it along the way. So I found that to be also quite entertaining that he did that. So we all took it, including my in-laws. Giles' mother was a famous dancer and movie actress, and her father, a Ukrainian Jewish refugee, French culture, but grew up mainly in the U.S. But they were distinctly of a French culture, not so much combined with Mexican. And Rocio, the mother, had been the lover of Miguel Covarrubias, who's a very famous figure in the 50s in Mexican culture. She'd also worked with Luis Buñuel as a cinema actress and so forth, was a soloist for the National Dance Company. And her daughter, Jael, was a great dancer. She specializes in Indian classical and does two styles. And so we took the LSD with also Giles' brother and sister and her parents, and their whole family, they're not drug people. They don't reject them. They will drink socially as I do, but not as an everyday thing. And they weren't against LSD and any of that thing, but they weren't into, like me, I'm a real druggie. To me, it's a kind of food, and I try to survive as much as possible on alkaloids and as little as possible on carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So that, and that was the first time, and I believe the only time, that Anita ever took LSD. But she took a half a dose, 50 micrograms. Everyone else took 100 micrograms. And this was Albert's stash. And at that time, I showed him a photograph from a rustic rural laboratory on the Oregon coast in Seaside, Oregon, of a pile of 3.5 kilograms of LSD tartrate that we had made in a woodshed in an area where one of the final scene of Easy Rider was filmed. And Albert was completely astonished, and that's when he told me they'd only made about 50 or 100 grams. And he asked me at least 3 times, "That's all LSD?" There was a pile like this big, drying under heat lamps, made from 10 kilograms of ergotamine tartrate. And so we had a fantastic trip. I mean, I remember we were all huddled outside the house, arm in arm, the whole family with Albert and Anita. And then Jael danced both Bharatanatyam and Odissi. And I've lived in India for about a year, and I'd never seen anyone who did it better than she did. She was really good. And so, because she had the sensual side, which the Indian dancers have lost. So that was kind of like the highlight of the trip. And in retrospect, as I say, we often would laugh about this, the strange character Arnoldo. And I didn't know at that time that he liked me, that I wouldn't say he liked me. I was the most tolerable human animal of the region, and everyone else was like his enemy, and only because I would walk in preference to driving in a car, as he did. And so, well, I've always had this this. I don't have any kind of plans or any kind of scheme of life, and I have always lived by what I call signs and portents. I don't believe. I try not to believe in anything except myself and my friends and my favorite drugs and so forth. I'm very much anti-religious, but everyone has certain superstitions, and you can even see them in domestic animals like dogs and cats. And it's a very animal thing to have superstitions, to make some wrong deduction from some casual thing that happens, and then it becomes a type of fixed belief system. Well, for me, it is this. I don't think there's such a thing as fate or luck, that we make our own beds and we're either obliged or privileged to sleep in them. And freedom is about taking responsibility. The other side of the coin reads responsibility. In Gordon Wasson's great book, Mushrooms, well, Valentina and Gordon Wasson's great book, Mushrooms, Russian History, at the very end, he says, most people don't want freedom, however they may talk. And at the time, I thought, I was 25 when I first read that, I thought that was very strange because my whole effort in life was to be free and to get free of the draft of my family, the war in Vietnam, and so forth, the system, and be able to survive independently. And I decided to become a writer at the age of 13 and started to prepare myself for that because it was the only thing I could think of at the time that I thought I could do. I'd heard that there was such a thing as a freelance writer, and it was as much laziness and indolence as anything else. I don't like getting up in the morning, and so I decided that early on. But along the way, I got this superstition, if you will, of signs and portents. And so I hate making plans and decisions and so forth. And the superstition is that when I actually really need something or some bifurcation in the path, some decision has to be made, that the information will be available to me, that the universe will offer that information, and you just have to be attentive and present in the present and aware of the signs and portents. And I admit it's as much laziness as anything else. But to be free means to swim against the current, because everything tries to put you in the same rat race maze as everyone else. And I found that Wasson was right, that people do not want to be free because it implies taking responsibility. So when something goes wrong, as inevitably it will, no matter how aware, how right living, there's a lot of not unfall accident, there's a lot of random things that can happen. And so you have to take responsibility. So when things go wrong, you don't. It's not because it's because of my family, my wife, it's because of my fucking job, the government, or whatever. You just look in the mirror. What did I do wrong? Or the relationship goes to hell, or it turns out that it was really not a good potential partner, and so forth. It's not to blame that person, but to ask oneself, why did I put myself in that position? That's what I mean by taking responsibility. And that's what is hard about freedom. Also, you have to have a strong stomach and be a tough person, because you have to swim against the current. So, signs and portents, that's how I've always guided myself, and a few times in life I've come to like a bifurcation. Like when I finished my undergraduate studies, I could either remain in the city and do graduate work in pharmacognosy at the University of Washington, where I studied natural products chemistry, but I was never a student there. I was kind of a crasher, and I didn't want to live in the city. I don't like cities. And so right at that moment, there came out of the blue, through a connection through Richard Evans Schultes again, an offer of a real meager stipend in Mexico to study Mexican shamanic plants. And so there was really no decision to be made. I like, the adventure path, what Jack London called the adventure path. So that appealed to me much more, and so that's what I did, and never any kind of decision about it. So it's always been that way, signs and portents, and it's the same with literary work, with literary composition. I never plan anything, no outline, nothing, and I will become the first reader, and I'm often very surprised by what comes out. And if I wish to know what I really think about something, the best way is not to think about it at all, but for it to come out spontaneously in writing. I just wrote a book about this called Mute Words, and it's completely spontaneously written, and the theme is this process, which I call spontaneous literary parthenogenesis, or inspiration. What is inspiration? It's not a mental process. And so for me, guiding in life also isn't a mental process, and in everyday life, I try not to think. I do a lot of stupid things. I do a lot of counting of things and so forth to keep myself in the present and not spinning the wheels mentally, and I only dedicate about an hour a day to thinking time, and writing is a non-thinking process, and I do a lot of that, and that's when I'm happiest. So the reason I mention this is I had, when I broke up with Jael, my second wife, that was I was on a trip in Chile and Argentina studying snuffs, pretty long trip with Manolo Torres, and Christian wasn't there, but he joined the group on a subsequent expedition, and then when I came back, as Paul Simon saying, when I come back to bed, someone's taken my place, so I was like replaced by another person, and so we had been together for 10 years. We had gotten married maybe a year and a half before. I've been married twice in 10-year relationships, and it was both times the beginning of the end of the actual formal marriage. Anyway, so I made a deal with Jael. I said, well, when you want the house, it's yours. I paid for it, but it was on her family's land. I'd lived there for a dozen, I ended up living there 13 years or so. But for her career, she went to Mexico City because all the art scene in Latin America is centered in the capital cities. And she had her daughter, and she advanced in her dance career, and I stayed living with her family for another 6 years. And so I said, all I want is 1 year's warning when you want the house, because when her daughter was old enough to go to school, she wanted her to be in the country, not in the city. And so that came on in June 2000. And so I had to be out of the house by the 1st of July 2001. So being the way I am and hating to make plans and so forth, I decided, okay, I won't even bother with this until 1 month before that, and then I'll see about finding some other place to live. And I wasn't even sure about staying in Mexico, but my only criterion was farther from the U.S. And so that's kind of not just strange, but it's also kind of irresponsible because I had a lot of equipment, laboratory, and books. It wasn't just me that had to move. So I wasn't even going to think about it until then. But as fate would have it, within a couple of months before June, when I would have to dedicate a month to finding where I was going to live, who should come to me but this same Beatriz. And she wished to sell me this land and this house where we'd had this strange experience with Albert, Anita, and I. And because she said her husband then had dementia, and couldn't live there. And she had her own house in Hofmann. She didn't ever really live there. And so it was 60 hectares, and she wished to sell me the upper half, 30 hectares with the house, about a 220 square meter, pretty well-built house with a great library, fantastic library and space. And so so that came to me without doing anything at all. And that was a sign and portent. And also the fact that I knew that house with Albert and Anita was another very important sign and portent to me. And so I ended up renting the house for 1 year. While the sale was arranged, and she sold it to me for much less than it's really worth. I had to pay cash for it, and it was like $120,000 or something. But 30 hectares was a good house, but without electricity. And so she told me that she wanted me specifically to buy the house because I would keep her husband's dream alive. That's what she said. He had been installing a hydroelectric system. He'd already put in a 620-meter hydraulic PVC tube, but he hadn't gotten to the point of installing the turbine and the inverter and so forth. But they had all the equipment primitive by today's standards. And I had always wished in the two houses I built to make them autonomous in energy, but I hadn't gotten to that point, again, because of indolence. Once it was livable, then I had other things to do. And so I hadn't gotten to that point. So she wanted me to buy it specifically because I would complete that project. And she told me that I was the person that Arnoldo liked, the only person in the area. And so that was that serves as a pretty good example of the signs and portents. And I later, of course, told Albert that now that was my home, and it turned out to be a fantastic place for me, better than I could have imagined. And if I had spent that year looking for a place and so forth, I probably would have found something nowhere near as good. I didn't even know this was available until 3 or 4 months before I had to move, and I would have foreclosed that option and the chance of having this real rural paradise with big platanus, sycamore trees, and tree ferns, 2 streams crossing the property of the river below. Really a fantastic place. Unfortunately, I don't live there now because there were 2 fires, arson fires, when I was on trips. That's another story. And so now I'm not living there, but I really bought it to conserve it because it's the biggest piece of it's not primary forest, but it's big high canopy forest. And so it really was the fact that I knew that through Albert I didn't have any decision, okay, I'll do it, I'll buy it. I had maybe twice that much money in cash saved up. And so that became my home, and I lived there for about 12 or 13 years. And I built another laboratory there, and so on and so forth. So then with the LSD book, this is really very strange. Albert was completely shocked that it didn't sell at all in the U.S., which was quite strange. But of course, it wasn't promoted, and books are a commodity in the U.S. and it's like there are seasons of fashion and so forth. And so we had bought the remainders, and then there was a paperback edition from a small publisher in, I think it was California. And that also, I think it only sold a total of about 6,000 or 7,000 copies in the U.S. But then Albert and I, in Zoloturn, we signed the first editions and sold them for a much higher price. and now through Amanda Fielding, the Beckley Foundation in England, she negotiated with Oxford University Press a really good edition of LSD, My Problem Child, with the Insights Outlooks, which is Albert's philosophy of life. And it was very important to him to have that properly translated. He somehow saw right away that I was serious about writing and literature, because by the time I met him, I'd been a writer for 15 or so years. And to me, it took me 25 years to really learn how to write English. I had my own plan of studies outside of school, and reading literature very deeply and devouring a certain writer. In those days, you had to find the musty old books, actual physical books, and then I would. I always had a lot of correspondence because I went to 8 different schools when I was school age, and so I was always writing letters to former friends and so forth. Always been a big correspondent. So that's where I would practice, just as sometimes painters will go to the Museo del Prado and paint great paintings and so forth. So I would kind of imitate their styles to develop my own style. But it was 25 years before I thought I had graduated from apprentice to journeyman, and that's when it became basically automatic, something that is not only non-mental, it's not no effort, and it's actually what I like doing the most, except for maybe tripping on acid. I've never tried writing on acid, or maybe I should. One time I came back from a long trip. One of the problems of where I live, it's perfect for me in every way, except to get here, it took me 38 hours of traveling, because I have to get to town, take a bus to Mexico City, etc. One time after that, I don't like getting up in the morning, so if it's an early flight, I will just stay up the night before and then lose another night on the trip. I got back from one of these long marathonic trips. I was living alone still in Rancho Yuki, late 90s, and I decided I'm going to try taking a massive dose of acid. I'm totally exhausted, and you'll see what happens, because I know it's a great stimulant. In low doses, it's just about the same as methamphetamine. If you take a sub 25 micrograms about, it's like methamphetamine. And so I took, was at least a 500 microgram, maybe closer to 750. And it was fantastic. It was great. And of course, it wiped out all of the weariness and exhaustion from the trip. And it was one of the most emotional trips that I've ever had, because I grew up with a kind of a shell, because I was beaten by my father, and I didn't fit into the program, and I didn't want the program, and it was imposed on me. And so for me, acid has been a way to connect with emotions, and what David Luke was saying, I entirely agree with. Everything about natural science I learned out of books. Artificially, no culture, I didn't learn anything about names of plants or uses of plants from family, from my parents, or anything. It was just all artificial, and there's no U.S. I call it USAN, because American means the whole continent. I used to call us USANs, and the Latins like that because usano is like gusano, which means worm, and so. It did connect me with nature, just as he was saying. I always had and the only thing that ever made me get an emotional reaction was the story of the American Indians, the Trail of Tears, the extermination of indigenous culture in what is now the United States. And it's not strictly a U.S. phenomenon. It was even worse in Brazil than in the U.S., and there are many fewer indigenous people in Brazil than there are in the U.S. And that always made me sad. That touched me somehow, and nothing else did. My first wife wrote a song about me called Heart of Stone. Imagine that. And so through LSD, not only could I connect with nature, but sometimes emotion would come out, and I would have a more emotional reaction. Only later in life, when my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived 98 years, hand-wrote the story of her life. Only then did I find out that I had a small portion of Delaware Indian blood, and the Delaware Indians were banished and desterrado, they say in Spanish, taken from their land, literally, 6 times. They were from the Atlantic coast, they were taken to Oklahoma, and they ended up in the swamps in Florida, and the culture basically died out. And that explained to me something like there was some kind of genetic memory or something deeper than anything I knew or had experienced that made this connection, emotional connection that otherwise I didn't really have. And I had to learn these things kind of by observing other people and so forth. It's very difficult for me to cry, but sometimes it happens but anyway, that particular trip was a real emotional one, and that's what I like. When I'm often in like an ayahuasca or conference or something like that, sometimes it's like a circle, and what is your desire for this trip? And I always say, I want to see aliens or plant spirits or all the other things that other people talk about, which I've never had any kind of experience like that, or I've certainly been out of body. But what I look for in these things is what I call the translinguistic state. And if I take enough, and now that means like 500 micrograms of acid or more, I get into a translinguistic state where first I lose languages. First Spanish goes, then English goes, and then suddenly you can't put a name on things, and so you can't objectify the world, and so I call that translinguistic. To me, that's the essence of this experience. And if you can't put a name on things, then you're seeing it directly and not analyzing it. You're not filtering it through this linguistic programming.
John, I'm so sorry. I have to filter through the time.
I'm out of time. Okay.
Maybe if somebody wants to, if you want to have some 5 minutes, 10 minutes for questions.
Okay. All right. I can go on all night, all day and all night. If anyone would like to ask me anything, anything's on the table. I don't like hide anything. So, I mean, it wasn't meant to inform, but just but anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Leaving everyone speechless. Yes.
The question would be, could you go to further from what you are saying? I mean, this linguistic dissolution.
Translinguistic.
You said that when you took LSD, you lost touch with language.
With language, yes. And I'm a very, that's what I do. I'm a writer.
And then what happens to you? What was the specific discovery you made or revelation you had? Was it a direct contact with?
Yes, it's experiencing things directly without any kind of analytical filtering, and it could be frightening for some people. The first time it happened to me, I didn't know that it could happen, and it was frightening. But yes, it's like experiencing directly. Really seeing for the first time. That's what ecstasy is to me. Ecstasy means standing outside oneself. But as this is like standing outside one's mind, this linguistic programming and the constant internal dialogue, a lot of Oriental discipline is to stop that, to stop the thinking process, and so forth. And that it does that for quite a long time, and to me, that's what I'm looking for in it. But I never have seen aliens. I've never seen anything other than what I would ordinarily see, but in a very different way. I say that it enables one to experience the universe more as energy and less as matter, the way it really is, because we really only can see energy. What we see is electromagnetic waves bouncing off the surfaces of things, and the things aren't solid anyway. They're just made of energy. And so energy is eternal delight, as William Blake so beautifully said. It enables one to experience the universe as energy, not as matter, and that's the way it really is, and that's a non-materialistic state. And part of this objectifying, analyzing, that's what materialism is. And so that's basically what I look for in it. And to me it's very enjoyable. I'm not there, but something is there. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yes. Or one more? Sorry.
I have one question about Albert Hofmann and maybe your insights into how he liked to dose and get high on acid. If you had any stories about how often was he getting high?
I actually never.
What did he like to do, when he was getting high on acid?
I never asked him that, and now that he's gone and Gordon Wasson's gone, there's so many things. I feel stupid. Why didn't I ask this, that, and the other? What I was mostly should have asked him is how many self-experiments he did back in the 50s, the late 40s and the 50s, because he must have done a lot. And I don't think there's any way of finding out now, because, for example, he had tried lysergic acid amide, or ergine, as an artificial compound, and found that it was psychoactive. And then later it was found to be the active principle of the morning glory seeds. But he must have made about 150 derivatives. LSD was one of many, and we know of several that he tried, but I would have liked to have known how many self-experiments he had done. But I never asked him about his personal use. But I know from friends that it must have been not like every weekend or anything like that, but when the right circumstance, certainly he took it fairly regularly. I don't take it that often myself, as when the circumstances are right, usually with certain friends. The last time was in Chile in 2019, I think. Big dose. Georgia Samarini was there, Stacy Schaefer, Luis Eduardo Luna. It was kind of like a rural place. So when the circumstances are right, we took big dose, really good. I love it. It's my favorite. Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.